rights.
All righty then. It's the 7th of June. Welcome to Dis and Dat. I should have said yesterday was the penultimate episode. Today is the final, hopefully. I'll get to the damn end. On the Tupinamba article, Gabriel Tupinamba on the Commons, I think it's important to remember the whole point of the article, and that is to explain why the Commons is sort of the key to trying to see whether there's a kind of revolutionary potential, a way in which you can the left can move forward in some ways. And I think it is the way in which we redefine it, or the way it has been appropriated, that we often have issues about it. I think that it has its own evolution, and I think it's important that we sort of see whether we're all at the same point. I think ultimately that's the conclusion. The end of the article sort of suggests that, but kind of hems and haws and sort of throws in a lot of other stuff. So I'll leave it to you to worry about in your reading, because it's not my article. I think I would have tried to clear it up a little bit more by the time we got to the end. I have some examples, and I'll show those examples. If you've already opened the article, you'll see the examples that I'm going to use that I think exemplify, or at least serve as a marker, a entry point, as it were, to how to assess this type of analysis, that is using a Zizek's point of view, a kind of way of rethinking what abstract elements are, and to see that they can be useful and motivating. And ultimately it is, for Zizek, I think, a theory of media that I don't think he likes coming out and saying it like that, but I think that it is that kind of element that resolves some of the same other issues that we've been looking at, the relation of people and nature, of humans and nature, and the eco-socialist problem of the Anthropocene. All of those things are embodied in this problem of what we think is common, or the commons. And I add a little thing on social construction, because I think, in fact, there are many ways to look at a social construction problem, and I think the period that we've gone through on intersectionality has overdetermined that set of relations. So it overdetermined in the sense that people neglect all of the other material elements in favor of identity questions or subjectivity questions. So that's the other problem that we're currently working through. And you can see that issues of, for example, anti-Semitism, et cetera, are all part of the intersectionality problem. Okay, so I begin with two quotes. The day will come more powerful than you're throttling today. And kind of sounds, Star Wars-like. I shall be more powerful than blah, blah, blah. The radical but common right-wing belief that property rights trump all other rights inexorably leads to the destruction of natural wonders. And so I'm going to kind of work through the Lacanian question. This is another definition of how Lacan sort of considers the Borromean knot. And the issue here is that you have three registers: it's symbolic, imaginary, and real. The Borromean knot no longer represents the psychic structure. Well, but Lacan will say it is the structure as such. That's the small letter A. Why he moves to this idea of trying to work through what the fourth element is. One way in which he approaches it is to name it as the father's name, and then that gets all into the nice Freudian sort of thing. I don't think that he finally sticks on that point, but it is his way of thinking about an entry point for the symptom. And finally, it concludes that in reality, there's the three linked registers that hold each other, and it is from this the existence of its own consistency. And it'll be no longer considered a trigger, but the possibility of a slip in the knot. And this being the possibility of a bad tie of the same. The point being, of course, that what we see in film, for example, and as I unfortunately comment on occasional episodes of Twilight Zone, is that it is a psychotic break of some kind. So that's kind of where the Borromean knot comes loose. So here's the article itself, and we're on another section, and I included a little element here that talks a little bit about the scientific tradition, and the question of science and culture comes together in certain other people's writing, like Bogdanov, et cetera. It's that these are not separate activities. These are acts of knowledge. And one of the bigger problems in general, the use, for example, I got myself in trouble at one job because in a public setting, I asked a question of someone who yacked too much about Thomas Kuhn. Why is it that we always return to the Kuhnian well? And then I got myself in trouble for some reason. On the other hand, they gave me a better course the next term. You brought it up, you explained it. Against the monopoly of alienation, this is the final section. Against the monopoly of alienation, a monopoly of alienation would be the power, concentrated power, perhaps, of alienation. This is the question looking at throughout the article, and that is this relationship, as was identified in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, of this relationship between estrangement and alienation, whether one is a bigger thing than the other thing, or is a subset of the other thing. And, you can play with that however you want. The point is that there is a kind of a set of variables here that they're not quite identical. Alain Badiou developed a theory of generic procedures distinguishing different practices in which human activity is capable of exceeding its own cultural limitations: science, art, love, and politics. Kind of problematic for some people to put all those things together, but in fact, had Badiou's work been known to me when I was teaching, this would have been a really important thing to lead a lecture with, but I just wasn't smart enough then. Well, when I was teaching this topic, it was 15 years before that. For Badiou, what these different and fundamentally heterogeneous and autonomous fields have in common is that in all of them, man is pulled out of his own cultural context by his creations: new scientific breakthroughs, new artistic works, love encounters, and new political experiments, confronting us with the emergence of previously unthinkable possibilities. This is where the Kuhnian stuff comes in, Thomas S. Kuhn. But what makes these procedures properly generic is not only that in their novelty they transcend their context of origin, but rather that they make themselves transhistorically available for others to equally remove themselves from the limits of their own historical situations. So it's not strictly determinative, and it suggests a kind of vanguard approach, I suppose. A Greek tragedy, for example, this is the Grundrisse sort of argument, remains somehow our contemporary, even though everything from the world in which it was conceived is now gone. And so do scientific conjectures, the story of love, and the egalitarian political experiments. They remain available to us today, not because they captured the essence of who we are, but because, as proofs of our incapacity to remain ourselves, they remain other to us to eternity. So this is that thing, right? That psychoanalytic thing, self and other. This is this question of always trying to work through something that's beyond ourselves. In that sense, this component reminds us that there is this issue of alienation in the antagonism of the commons, noting that Zizek is talking about this antagonism as this other issue was just mentioned above. And so this is the integration in this article of Badiou and Zizek. The focus here is on the reformulation of the antagonisms connected with the commons of external culture, which we call the monopoly of alienation. the evocation of Badiou's theory of the generic procedures is useful for us here because it allows us to see how it is that the enclosure of the commons of external culture accounts for the absorption of our generic weakness, stay with me, by the vortex of structural unemployment, turning unemployed time into a commodity which we can no longer confront us as an alien power, while simultaneously producing a division of social space in which we are never confronted with the limits of our cultural forms of life. Now, you could argue that maybe even Occupy was that sort of thing, but I don't know. This process is highlighted in Table 2, which I just showed. It's the monopoly of alienation, even though alienation has been used as a translation of both Hegel's Antasserung and Entfremdung, leading to much confusion in the Hegelian and Marxist literature. By monopoly of alienation, we mean specifically the monopoly of experiences of self-estrangement, processes whose social efficacy depend on the inversion of the relation between creator and creation. For Badiou, there is a qualitative distinction between the procedures of love, art, and science on the one hand, and that of politics on the other. Well, the first three are composed of finite elements, a couple in love, a sequence of paintings or musical compositions in art, a set of theorems or experimental protocols. In science, only the political generic procedure is immediately composed by a certain virtual summoning of everyone. So here's a long Badiou quote, and sort of bear with us here. This is Badiou, and I think it's in translation. So politics is a sole truth procedure that is not only generic in its result, but also in the local composition of its subject. Only politics is intrinsically required to declare that it is the thought of all. This declaration is its constitutive prerequisite. Constitution or constitutivity is an important issue. All that the mathematician requires, for instance, is that at least one other mathematician to recognize the validity of this proof, often an important issue. In order to assure itself of the thought that it is, love need only assume the two. The artist ultimately needs no one. Science, art, and love are aristocratic truth procedures. Of course, they are addressed to all and universalize their own singularity. But the regime is not that of the collective. Politics is impossible without the statement that people, taken indistinctly, are capable of the thought that constitutes the post-evental political subject. This statement claims that a political thought is topologically collective, meaning that it cannot exist otherwise than as the thought of all. So this is the presumption of the social contract, et cetera, et cetera. This qualitative distinction perfectly mirrors Zizek's remark of the difference between the first three antagonisms of the common and the fourth one, the one of external culture. And in fact, allows us to finally draw out one essential trait of this asymmetry. That is, while the commons of nature and internal culture are all commons at the level of consumption, or as Badiou puts it, are composed of finite material, but addressed to all, only the commons of external culture concern the active participation in the production of something that is universal. Which is also why science, love, and art can continue to exist, even if increasingly constrained to the class of intellectual workers in a world sinking into barbarism, like today. Only the generic dimension of politics is properly impossible under our contemporary conditions. This is not to say that to each antagonism corresponds one of Badiou's generic procedures. Rather, this comparison helps us to understand why it is that the more a procedure requires us to access a productive or emancipatory experience of self-estrangement, in which the immediate indifference to one another is at play, the less this procedure is available for us today. Love seems, at least at first, to be the most democratic of the emergences of the generic today, since it is composed of a small number of individuals, inviting them to create an enclosed space of their own, an intimacy in which cultural differences might have their efficacy suspended. The whole issue of sex as the ultimate moment of communication, blah, blah, blah. Still, as psychoanalysts can surely attest to, while most analysts used to lie on the couch suffering from the impotence of living up to what their lovers' expectations are, today there is a growing tendency for patients to seek help due to the anguish of not managing to remain sufficiently independent from their partners. The very estrangement produced by an encounter with another's desire is subjectivized more and more as a violence against one's integrity, an obscene demand that one seeks no longer to answer but to silence. Art seems to be equally available today. The solitude of the artist, while not generic, like the solitude of lovers, guarantees that art can take place even if there is only one human left alive. This is the artist in their garret. However, unlike love, art requires the use of certain formal means, the creation and adoption of rules of composition, procedures to analyze and evaluate a sequence of artistic experiments, and so on. And here we already find that most of us are simply deprived of access to this formal dimension. This is not to say that we are not all welcome and in fact incited to express ourselves creatively today. Rather, what we witness is that as varied as our forms of cultural expression might be, their common limit is the aversion to any means which would detach creativity from the individual and cultural contexts of which it is the expression. The evaluation of art is dislocated to its capacity to exteriorize its cultural determinants rather than to transcend them. If this narrows the means for the production of art on the side of consumption, this enclosure of estrangement also makes itself meant. The urge for artists to become painters, to become illustrators, printmakers to become graphic designers, sculptors to become artisans. Consider, for example, when the veritable incapacity most of us experience when trying to listen to modern musical compositions, though the lack of musical education surely is an important part in how unbearable the experience of listening to Bartok, Berg, or Messiaen can be, there seems to be an underlying reason why this lack is not even experienced as such. That is, we simply do not have the subjective means to tarry with the necessary indifference to tonality and to our natural rhythms to arrive at the music, simply assuming that the irritating indifference these compositions present to our daily musical environments to mean that they belong to another time and place. Scientific formalism, on the other hand, does require a really existing community. The repeatability of an experiment or of a proof process is an essential formal component of the scientific breakthrough. And this repetition within different cultural contexts is what demonstrates science's ultimate indifference to any particular world. And even though the existence of a scientific community is preserved by the enclosure of the commons of internal culture as we analyze the social role of knowledge in contemporary capitalism, we are faced with a growing disjunction between science's ubiquitous existence in our lives and our vanishing capacity to even experience this infrastructure as scientific. While technological advances reach beyond what any of us could anticipate, truly exciting the imagination of Marxists to see in this the increase in humanity's productive forces, our capacity and interest for understanding how technology works, to relate to it not as users, but as producers, decreases in vertiginous velocity. Finally, this leads us back to politics and to our concluding remarks. Nowhere, as in political organization, that is, in the singular sort of experience which departs from the affirmation that equality is possible for everyone, is the lack of an access to self-estrangement more immediately present. This is that revolutionary question. First of all, as a lack of critical tools, as a brief overview at the history of Marxism will attest to, we simply have not developed the conceptual resources to analyze our own historical experiments in terms of their genericity or self-estrangement. This is quite understandable. The bases of Marxism were all historically established while the horizon of the society of work was still supported by a capitalist dynamic of accumulation. That's the code of capital, underlying part of the code of capital, which is why a theory of labor based on the hypothesis of a strong nature, that is, based on a principle that what is human should always be recognizable as human, made it both irrelevant and impossible to construct a view of our own organizations in which their eventual autonomization from the original political purposes were not conceived a priori as a detachment from its social basis or its bureaucratization. Because of this conceptual deficit, our own critical account of the astounding social catastrophes brought about by the first large-scale communist experiments remains hindered. While some of us are still incapable of distinguishing the terror of Nazi fascism's success from the terror of the Soviets' failure, most of us have only managed to explain the political clinamen, the bias that leads from Lenin to Stalin, by referring to the latter's almost inhuman capacity to single-handedly alter the course of history. But this incapacity, this is why we read Stalin still, why this incapacity to theoretically assume self-estrangement as an ambivalent force does not only show itself when we consider the past, is also an essential characteristic of the practice of collective organization today. Just as in the case of art, in which everything is permitted as long as what is created remains connected to its creator, it's sort of authorial dominance, political practice today is polymorphous and multiple. The political scene is composed of party politics, both in its electoral and its revolutionary forms. Social movements of different institutionalization, different forms of protest and direct action, occupations of land in public areas, and so on. But what is equally excluded from all of them is the wager that discipline can be a tool for political emancipation. And this word discipline is important here because, you know, party discipline is incredibly problematic, especially for Democrats. By discipline, we do not mean mere rule following, even though that is what we usually understand by the term, but rather the following of rules which ourselves have chosen to adopt, or in other words, the subjection to a created rule of which we are in fact the sovereign creators. This is that subjectivity question. The definition highlights how discipline requires a form of self-estrangement, since we must trust the application of a formal principle created in a given context beyond the limits of that context. Now, if I were going to put a joke in here, it would be, you know, everyone's got to have a safe word. Two things seem to prevent the alienation in a political rule from being experienced as a source of emancipation. First, political processes which constrain themselves to their own fragment of the working class never face the need for enduring the externality of their own culture, since within these different segments, some level of social homogeneity is already guaranteed by the state and by communitarian values. In short, political experiments which really test their concrete claim universality rarely take place. Second, just in the case of artistic and mathematical formalism, the formal dimension of politics has become almost subjectively unbearable. Even though we're used to thinking that what corrupts political experience are the psychic, moral, and personal effects of social inequality, the experience of collective political organization clearly shows that it is experience of equality which is truly anguishing. The artificial creation of a space in which the real equality of all is affirmed, a practical affirmation maintained through practical formalist protocols which render militants indifferent to their social, economic, and identificatory markings, increasingly wounds our sense of self, often leading to the development of the crudest of psychopathological responses. That's actually an important point. I could use an example like anti-Semitism, for example, or calling someone a sexist or a racist or whatever. These are all become problematic in the language or in the language sphere. All of this leads us to formulate the hypothesis that the main presentation of the antagonism of the commons of external culture today is not the concrete division of our social space, i.e. walls, but rather the monopoly of the empowering dimension of social alienation in the hands of the managers and technicians responsible for keeping already existing social structures in place today. The premise accepted by leftists and conservatives alike, though to the benefit of the latter, that alienation is always an oppressive and treacherous force, ultimately antithetical to our human nature and freedom, constitutes a sort of subjective enclosure, the deactivation of the political potential of certain formal tools which have the vocation of exposing us to our own inhuman excess, which Marx called our generic being and whose unemployable quality is equally subtracted from value, property, and communitarian relations. Marx and Engels famously wrote in the German ideology that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. I might just as an aside mention that, the concrete form, if I accuse my enemy of using innocent civilians as shields, I automatically give myself, what kind of license, right? It's to kill everybody. And that's just to propose that argument and one's tacit acceptance of it is incredibly problematic. One's silence, in fact. Perhaps when considered from our current perspective, this slogan can be given a new meaning. For ideology is not simply the process of assumption of an ideal that is overdetermined by the social situation, but also an operation through which we are brought to abdicate from certain aspects of social reality, among them, tools for effective social transformation, which, rejected in the name of preserving one's identity, becomes the exclusive property of our political adversaries. And lest you think the human shield argument is fanciful and problematic, it is actually used more often in some recent cinematic products, right? Shoot the hostage, shoot through the hostage. These are interesting things proposed in some popular products. In this sense, the proposition that the ruling ideas are those of the ruling class do not state that certain ideas rule over us because they inherently reflect the interests of the ruling class, but rather that the ruling class has a monopoly of ideas which have the power to rule over social processes. This is the Frankfurt School legitimation stuff. That is, those practices which concern the transformation, construction, of maintenance of the social order, that the struggle against the enclosure of the commons of external culture can only be practically conducted through political experiments whose genericity is only truly put to the test if the formal force of collective organization is capable of extending itself to those walled-off places excluded from the capitalist forms of socialist reproduction, seem to endow the communist hypothesis with a possible historical and concrete determination. I think anti-apartheid is an important element there. So I know it gets to this external place where we may not kind of understand where they got to the end, and it seemed a little abstract, but let me attempt to concretize this with some examples. And because I have a little experience in talking about and yakking about public culture, I'm going to show some examples. What is in this is this stuff here is the notes and the references. I included all of them. You can see it's an interesting reading list, really a broad reading list, one that is both a very classical and post-classical in that sense. So first example that I would use is this kind of enclosure of external culture in a commons, can it be exemplified, for example, by the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial? Recall that in its Maya Lin's original plan for it was to have it subsurface and with the list in chronological order of every American death, all 58,000 plus, on the walls, so that it is a memorial to every person who died in Vietnam. Note, of course, that this was not without its conflicts. One of the guys who headed the financing of the product objected seriously and tried to impose his own artistic will. He's not trained as an artist. Maya Lin has a architecture degree from Yale. These are, and this was incredibly problematic and racist, if with all due respect, at the initial conception of the work. And note, of course, that a sculpture of figures was eventually put in after the fact, and that there is a women's memorial that is also proximal to this site. Note, of course, that in my standard lecture on this site, it includes the fact that this is also a site for performative activity. That is, I marked at one moment the first suicide on this site. A veteran committed suicide on this site. It was staffed 24/7 by veterans, but the guy got down there sometime in an evening and killed himself. So this is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and it is, I think, that site of that kind of activity. Now, the last two, which I may show if I can get the thing to play, and that's going to be a problem. Come on, you sucker. Well, apparently the little things I've got here are not activatable. I don't know why. Let me see if I can. Okay, the two things that I'm going to show here, and which for some reason I don't have I don't know why it disappeared. Well, there they go. Oh, Christ. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, informally known as the National Lynching Memorial, is a memorial to commemorate the Black victims of lynching in the United States. And if I can get this thing to come up, I'll show the videotapes that support this. The work itself is altogether self-explanatory in the sense that it is a work of large objects that also swing like bodies hanging from a tree, as it were. It is this idea, and I think that this is kind of a perfect example that slipped bore man not. So I don't know if I can get this sucker to come on to work, but I will close with that because I'm running out of time as well. Come on, you sucker. Give me a second. Hang in there, folks. They're just YouTube videos. Damn it. I don't know why it it was there when I put it together. It was there. Oh, there we go. Let's see if I can get this to work. There are two of them. One from the guy who's on the committee who created it, who I think is could be seen as the author of it, and he is a Harvard Law graduate, so you can see the intersection of the political and all the art stuff. So let me see if this is going to work.
We're in Montgomery, Alabama, at the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice. We've just walked through, and I feel emotionally overwhelmed.
I've been here over 20 times, and every time I'm teary and emotional, but in a good way. Because in those emotions, I'm able to feel and do what the memorials intend, to have an inner peace, but also a way to go forward and heal on this unspoken history in a way that honors the people who were the victims of lynching.
When I grew up, lynching was almost never spoken about, and it is America's great shame.
I heard some of that growing up in an African-American family. They used lynching as a way to educate us as children of what not to do. When it was taught in schools in Massachusetts, as where I grew up in the Boston area, it was individual actors. It wasn't seen as widespread. And this memorial shows it was political. It was violence that was widespread in almost every state of the United States except for a handful. And that becomes very clear as you walk through this memorial.
Walking through, starting at the top of the hill and winding down through a descending ramp so that these large Corten steel memorials begin to hang over your head, one after another, multiplying.
You're going through the cycle of a lynching, from the person while they were still alive and upright and at eye level to when they are strung up and over your head, and all you see at the base is the county, and at the end when they're laid out in coffin-like style, giving them the dignity and a burial that they never have. And it gets overwhelming when you see nothing but bottoms of the pieces and you no longer can see the names.
And that idea that this memorial is offering a kind of solace, offering a kind of funerary honor that these people had never been afforded is so moving, and feels to me that it has come too late, but I'm grateful that it has come at all.
They were not these unknown men, women, and children. They were fathers, they were mothers, and the crimes that they were accused of. A man, a minister, marrying someone is the reason why he was killed. Military veteran returning back from the Spanish-American War, killed at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. A husband, his family was killed because he voted. People came back to the house, killed his mother, his wife, and 2 children. It becomes clear that they were people. They were community members. And in death, they still deserve honor.
Lynching was a tool of repression. It was a tool to subjugate, to maintain the surveillance, terrorizing slave state that had existed before the war.
It's the ultimate form of what Caritha Mitchell calls know your place aggression. If you go outside your place for organizing a union, you could be killed. If you were to vote, you could be killed. If you were reprimanding children to get them to stop throwing rocks at you, you were lynched. It was the way to keep people submissive. But what I found telling is when you have more than one person killed on a day, around election times for voting, around labor organizing, and you have not one person, but 5 people, 10 people, 20 people.
Or entire communities that are attacked and burned.
Like Elaine, Arkansas, and the Tulsa massacre. This is a way to protect a system of white supremacy, was political violence with political intent.
So the challenge was how do you take that history of terror and translate that through architecture, through memorial sculpture, into something that is meaningful in the 21st century?
And this is the brilliance of this memorial. You are just settled with the name and the date. And even when not known, unknown as a name, you get a history lesson in a way that you can then have deeper conversations that you would not have before. And that's why this memorial is striking, and why it's bringing both peace for a community to heal, but also justice for the victims of this heinous crime. Ida B. Wells says that this was the national crime, and we need to acknowledge it as a nation.
And when I was walking through, looking at the justifications of why people were lynched, especially at those that were murdered because they had voted, it's hard not to look at contemporary politics and the efforts to suppress voting now. And this is not history in a sense. This is part of a continuing legacy.
And that's one of the things, a continual legacy of resistance, a refusal to accept one's place, and the understanding that the ballot matters the most, and why it's dangerous to be educated and to be politically savvy. And those are why we're having these debates now over voting rights, but also what gets taught in the classroom, because lynching was not taught in the classroom. And when you see it as not a one-off thing, but a long legacy in history, it becomes different in the present.
Walking up to one of these rectangular forms, they function as abstract human bodies, but also as grave markers, and transform that figure into a remembrance.
The families behind those names never forgot. And one of the most striking walls says, "We will remember." Families remembered, communities remembered. That refusal, that act is one of the reasons why we can have this memorial, because it went from safe spaces within the Black community to now national conversation.
The research and outreach to those families to gather those memories and bring them together here.
This wasn't unknowable. Families had this, but also newspapers documented these. Government reports and politicians used this and openly discussed this. So there's an acknowledgement of the families who never forgot and never got that healing, that they too can heal, not just the nation, and that what they did in this counteract of commemoration in scrapbooks and family diaries was valid. And that concern is now shaping the national conversations of what do we do now.
Okay, with that little bit of note, we've come pretty much to the. Come on. Bloody hell.
we have been practicing silence about our history for a very long time.
The other example that I wanted to use that connects this from a labor point of view is the monument to the Haymarket martyrs, which is also sort of collectively organized with a row of dissenters. So there is a Haymarket martyrs monument in Chicago, but that includes all kinds of political dissent, particularly for the working class and for women. Noting, of course, in America, the origin of an International Workers' Day is because of the Haymarket riots. Anyway, I think I've come to the end of my yammering, and so I'll stop and you can talk.
Thank you for that.
Anyone?
Hello, can you hear me?
No? I like to think that closing on this kind of idea that you can have art that is also political in that particular context is really important, and that monuments particularly serve that kind of purpose, since they are designed not for, on the one hand, for individual subjective reflection, but also for large-scale political antagonism, as it were. I think this is the idea of how a monopoly of antagonisms works. And so I would assert that what Zizek is talking about is not a new idea in terms of the concept of what counts as the didactic purpose of public art, which occurs, its own history goes back to the 19th century, the 18th century. But it still has its roots in the same political context, that is, for example, the French Revolution, and we can go to neoclassical art, etc. And when neoclassical art becomes more public, that is, when people can see, this is pre-photography, that representations of certain things, either masked as classical allegory of some kind, mythological allegory, but that also have political import, is sort of the first example of the kind of mobilizing of public imagery in terms of that type of artwork. Doesn't mean that other artwork wasn't happening at the same time. It certainly was, Romanticism, et cetera, realism. But we can say that, of course, that realism was also a reflection on these same kinds of public issues.
I wanted to say that that memorial was really something. I had not seen that before.
Got a wonderful design. I think it's it is, of course, I think obviously influenced by the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial. It has that same issue of recording memorializing names, the idea of naming.
Yeah.
In the Lacanian sense, this is the symptom, right? You see the name, there's a person behind that name, or recorded. That name was recorded. In some cases, they weren't recorded because of the obvious shame of erasing someone's identity.
And on the point of art being political, Michael Perenni, and I'm sure many others have
Oh yes.
observed that the function of one of the functions of abstract art is to make such political statements impossible, or so difficult to understand that they're basically meaningless. I don't know, there had been some suggestions that some governments had pushed abstract art because of that.
Well, it cuts both ways. The Soviet treatment of art initially as sort of idealized and what one should strive for, got replaced in the Stalinist period by the kind of surreal or hyper-real socialist realism, which is still the kind of dominant art form in, for example, North Korea.
Right.
And yes, Lane, all art is political in that it is, you know, if it's there, it has certain politics. If it sits still in the studio, it's not very political until someone finds it, I suppose.
Why is all art political?
Well, it's because it engages the other. That's the whole point of this little exercise here with this extensive article is the relation between self and other, expressing messaging, you know, expressing oneself to another, and that's why in Badiou's case of talking about science and art and love and politics is that's all kind of there. You can say that, as I've said, identity politics has been kind of overdetermined, and in fact, you could say that this piece on lynching is overdetermined in that sense. I think it will be ultimately not overdetermined when the first white supremacist terrorist act against this memorial happens, because at some moment, someone's going to attack this memorial.
That was my initial thought. Yeah.
It's in fucking Montgomery, Alabama, after all, right? So,
right.
I think all of those things obtain. Some asshole is going to go in and try and bomb this sucker, and whatever. It just raises that interesting kind of question. That's all.
Well, on the idea that all art is political because it engages the other, I mean, lots of things engage the other, but I wouldn't necessarily call them political.
No, but our reactions are political, aren't they? Can be. And it includes, it doesn't isolate. I think the issue in identifying, science, love, art, and politics is that some of these things are complicated, right?
Oh, they're all complicated.
Well, memorializing loved ones is, that's just what happens in cemeteries, right? So in fact, this is a memorial with no bodies in it. Do you see where the artists were going with this, or the architects were going with this?
Oh, I'm not disputing that this memorial is political, as well as being other things, but I'm questioning whether all art is political, because I think what you're doing, if you say that, is making the term political so broad that it becomes almost meaningless.
It's become reproblematized. So, for example, the entire discourse of feminism on sex being political is, or rape being essentially not about sex but about force or power, right? All of those things make it political in that context. And then there's the extreme version of that in terms of intersectionality, is that, and with all due respect, quoting Andrea Dworkin as sex as imperialism, right? I don't believe that. I just, whatever, but you can see where that can go, in terms of language, right?
Oh yeah, but I mean, it makes a difference if such statements are valid or not.
Well, I'm not going to, it's a problematic argument anyway to assume that that you have all of those things going on. But I would assert that most people's reality includes all of those other elements. I just saying, I mean, I would assert from an intersectional point of view, why are there no great women scientists? I know there are. I'm just proposing that using the same term that was brought forward in the field of feminist art about why there were no great women artists, or as one author referred to it, that Anonymous is a woman.
Right. But I mean, the reason that there are fewer, well-known female scientists, I would argue, is not because intercourse is imperialism.
Well, at one level, yes, but you could say that misogyny and male privilege has probably shaped the scientific enterprise. Wouldn't you say that?
Oh, definitely. Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just noting that it's an extreme, and it is an antagonism on the one hand.
Well, if it's not real, if her observation is false, um, then it has no bearing on this
Well, that's
discussion.
true. That's true from an empirical point of view. But the reality is, how many female Nobel Prize winners are there? With all due respect,
Right.
they
Oh,
are.
no, I agree. There's discrimination, there's patriarchy, there's et cetera, et cetera. I'm just saying that statement that Andrea Dworkin made is
Oh yeah,
not
yeah.
true,
I don't
as far as I
agree
can
with it. I mean, it's rhetorical, but there you can see how that can be weaponized, as they say,
Oh, almost definitely.
in discourse, and so that's kind of where we are. Is that we do have extremes or experiments or whatever. Nancy. Let me switch to Nancy, who will probably attack me on another score. I know. I'm just kidding.
Me, I never attack anybody.
Come on, Nancy.
Well, my question is about definitions, because sometimes, like the word politics could mean different things. So if you're not agreeing on the definition, then you're trying to talk about it. It makes it difficult to communicate. So, I mean, in one sense, like literally, about politics being, it says here, affairs of the city, or activities that are associated with making decisions in groups, or relationships among individuals. So, it's the people in groups. So if you're talking about art, it would be like, does the tree falling make a sound if there aren't any ears to hear it? So if you make art and nobody sees it, does it count as art? Or is it a political thing in that art is intended to be shared in a group?
Well, isn't art always intended for an other, isn't it? Right? You
I
make
don't know
work.
if that's true. Some people do art for themselves and never share it with a group or anyone else.
Well, that's that interesting question of what goes on in one's studio, whether you are making it for yourself or for some other to see, or the other to see is only one person.
But this other question about
it's that external versus internal. Let me just close with that.
The thing about women in society and political terms is, I have to say, I don't think most men, if any men, can ever really appreciate how women are essentially dehumanized, just unconsciously, made into sexual objects. It's a natural state in the political, in the group, in society. It's just the way it is. And it's because, I think it's very basic that most men, or even any men, are stronger physically and have dominated women just, physically, and assume that's the natural, correct state of being. That's why there are less women scientists. It's because men want somebody to take care of the children and have dinner ready and be there as a sexual object, just conveniently.
And then have time to do science.
Correct. And it's, when you're living your life, when you're the man scientist, you don't give any consideration to, oh, I wonder if my wife could have been something other than a wife. It's taken for granted. It's just, that's the way it is. And women take it for granted too. That's our place. That's it. I'm done. Sorry for. I
No,
attack all the men in the world, and they deserve it.
Yeah.
Wasn't it a little different in the communist states back in the day?
Darn, comrade. Yes. Yes, it was. Well, we recall this, of course, in the previous writings, Marx Lenin on the woman question, which is equally important. Why some Marxists resisted getting married. In fact, not simply because of some other reason, but although it was sort of based in a sort of biological kind of model of their permanent bonding is not a common feature in the natural world. There are some permanent bonds of and some heterodox or extraordinary couplings, like the two male penguins who serve as a couple, or whatever. But that this is that problem of modeling our own behavior after animals necessarily, or transcending that, however you want to call it.
Well,
This is to the effect of those things about quote unquote free love that Marxists talk about. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Joe. Joe, please.
Oh, yeah, no problem. I was just wondering if much of what John is concerned with had to do with his maybe paying a little too much at the auction house the other week and questioning the authenticity of the work.
Yes.
Questioning the authenticity of what?
The work you picked up at the auction house the other week.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, I'm just making a bad joke.
Oh. Haven't been to an auction house ever.
No, the value of artwork is often in question, and actually, to be serious about it, there's the whole system of auctions and forgeries is actually still a continuing problem.
Yeah, I got this book by Robert Natkin, who was an abstract artist who I met because I went to the same gym as he did. But I couldn't say that his paintings are political by any stretch of the imagination. They're pleasing to look at, some of them, many of them, but you just it's like looking at the tea in the bottom of a cup. You can make it, or looking at a cloud in the sky. You can make up anything about it, I suppose.
Well, let's take this a little bit further. What's it? The work of the so-called work called Piss Christ. On the one hand, is simply, if you didn't know what the title of it was, you would just think it's an abstract painting. On the other hand, knowing that it was that urine was involved in this abstract work, and there was sort of some vague image of the Christ on the cross, you get a whole bunch of other reactions to it, don't you? Or the Virgin Mary and the Virgin Mary and elephant dung, for example.
Right. Does that qualify as abstract? I mean, what is the definition of abstract?
Well, yeah, that's the whole issue of modernism, is that we have a kind of distension between having to title artworks and have artworks that are essentially, it's not about the title. You don't look at the little tag, you just sort of go there and experience the artwork, right, in the museum. I mean, some people go into museums and don't think about the author, the artist. They just try and see what was going, its effect on people, right? And that's how it should be, shouldn't it? Right? A kind of a non-literary, experience of the artwork.
It's been a while since I bid on the Piss Christ at the auction house. But I thought it was a sculpture. You're saying it was a painting?
Piss Christ, yes, was a painting.
Oh, I thought it was an actual crucifix that he put in a tube of urine or something.
No, it was a painting, and it is vaguely abstract and not really about Christ at all. But the fact that it was titled Piss Christ made people go crazy.
There was no urine in the paint?
Oh, yes, there was.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, in the paint itself?
Yes.
Oh, he pissed in the paint?
Yes. Well, as Lane is often wont to say, look it up.
Okay.
The other one is a Madonna that was in another exhibition that caused trouble. That was a black Madonna, but it was elephant dung, I think, was used in the some of the material. And the painting with poo is an entire psychological thing, right? It's a psychoanalytic thing that is it's not engaged in with in terms of infant behavior. Without getting into the whole deal, but that children playing with their poop is a kind of signifies something. I'm not sure what, but you can engage in that kind of analysis. It's unfortunate, but yes, you can. And in fact, that is the reflection on these works done by adult artists using feces. Similarly, in the history of art, there were women who used their menstrual blood as materials, and this is the whole challenge of the material paradigm for artwork.
Challenge
Robert?
meaning you're challenging the
It's an avant-garde thing. It's a challenging convention, right? Would you pay
yeah.
money, like in the what's the name, Hearst's work? You know, are you going to buy a big shark in a tank of formalin? Robert?
Hello,
Robert?
can you hear me? Hi,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wanted to say I was excited to see you presenting the equal justice video. I was listening to the presentation on YouTube when I was while I was vacuuming, and then I saw that you had that, and I got on the Zoom. But yeah, so he I met Brian Stevenson. He visited Sacramento at the NAACP. There was some NAACP banquet here, and
You're a little
he
garbled, Robert. I sort of can't hear you.
oh, Brian Stevenson had visited Sacramento in 2016. And he was I met him there, and I actually heard about him kind of funnily enough. He was interviewed on the Charlie Rose show. That's how I found out about him. And he they sell the Equal Justice Initiative on their website, that you can purchase the calendar, and it has a lot of these information on the lynchings and the legacy of white supremacy, etc. It's kind of gruesome, but every day there's some atrocities listed for that happened on that day of the year. Also, has moving on to another subject, there was talk about patriarchy and male domination. I was wondering if has anyone seen the movie Planet Earth. It was kind of a B movie, but I saw it in the '70s, and it's a sci-fi in which women ruled the earth and men were enslaved.
Oh
And
no!
it's a real mind bender to watch it as a man. Well, probably as a woman too, but I was like, oh wow, it just really confronted my you know my hegemonic sense of the world, I guess you could say.
Yes, that's exactly it. Or that the artwork
And
is counter hegemonic. That is, it challenges the beliefs.
yeah, I never hear about that movie. Interesting movie. And another one I saw more recently was it's a French movie, Jackie and the Kingdom of Women. Uh, do you know that one?
No.
Uh,
I just,
it's got Scarlett Gainsbourg in it. That's another one that it was like bending my brain to watch it. Like, oh, okay.
well, that's why some artists make stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was great. It was great. Some art, I appreciate art that punches me in the face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly kind of, and some are just ridiculous, right? The guy who duct taped the banana to the wall, right? And said it was worth $10,000. And then the other artist who came into the gallery with the banana taped to the wall and proceeded to rip the banana off the wall and eat it.
Mhm.
Of course, they do that in Florida, whatever.
I was so mad. I was going to bid on that at the auction house.
I don't make this stuff up. It just happens. These are really important. This is why art exists in a discourse of one kind or another.
Well,
Often
and
it's-
I,
John Hayes has his hand up. John?
Yeah, I'm not at home, so I don't know how crappy this sounds, but you
Fine.
mentioned animal feces, I believe, for some artwork.
Yes.
Well, it so happens that somebody gave me for a present, I don't know, maybe for Christmas, like a stocking stuffer a few years ago that's made out of elephant poop. The paper is made out of elephant poop. It's very rough, but I have two examples of it in my
Cool.
IG, and I'm trying to post them here, but again, because of where I'm at, maybe it's not.
Yeah,
it's kind of slow. Yeah.
Nancy put up the artwork that had the elephant dung in it in the chat.
Oh, well, that was done by somebody else. Mine are done by me.
People are getting stopped. That they've sort of picked up on this, that artists are taking dung from their trips abroad and trying to get them through customs, and people are getting stopped with those things. Artists, that is, people who think they can use this as material.
Actually, he might have been wearing dungarees when I did these.
Oh, whoa. Darn art. Okay.
Well, I'll attempt to put them in there anyway.
Oh, we need to let's shut down the because we're just veering off here. Time to stop the live stream. Any other questions, comments, brickbats?
No, but related to something else, but not this. I'll mention later.
Okay. Thank you for your attention. We're over with this particular article, thank God, and we'll talk about something else tomorrow. I will post that link in a second.